India and China could be gearing up for a fresh geopolitical conflict. This isn't a conflict involving guns, soldiers, and warfare, but it is a conflict that concerns an absolutely vital geopolitical resource that neither India nor China can live without. That resource is water. And China's recent announcement that it will be going ahead with the development of a massive $137 billion dam on the Brahmaputra river has sent alarm bells ringing in India. India has been concerned that China could weaponize the flows of water from the Brahmaputra against India for years now. India-China relations are already tense, and climate change is making water an even more scarce resource. So could India and China really see a conflict over water? On this episode of Threadbare, we look at the water wars between India and China. What exactly is China doing with water? Why is India concerned? And would competition over water lead to active conflict between two nuclear powers? So let's start with the basics. Recently, China announced plans to build the world's largest hydroelectric dam on the Brahmaputra river in Tibet. With the price tag of $137 billion, this is also the world's most expensive infrastructure project. If successful, this could be an enormously valuable project for China. The dam is located in Tibet, in an area of the Brahmaputra river known as the Great Bend. The dam is estimated to generate approximately 300 billion kilowatt hours of electricity annually. That, by the way, is 3 times the output of the current largest dam, the Three Gorges Dam, also in China. But this new dam is generating concern in India. Here's what India's Foreign Ministry had to say.
As a lower riparian state, with established user rights to the waters of the river, we have consistently expressed, through expert level as well as diplomatic channels, our views and concerns to the Chinese side over mega projects on rivers in their territory. These have been reiterated along with the need for transparency and consultation with downstream countries following the latest report. The Chinese side has been urged to ensure that the interests of downstream states of the Brahmaputra are not harmed by activities in upstream areas. We will continue to monitor and take necessary measures to protect our interests.
For some time now, many in India have been concerned about China's development of large dams on the Brahmaputra river. The river itself originates in Tibet, which is under Chinese control. It enters India in Arunachal Pradesh and then flows southwest through the Assam Valley. After that, it enters Bangladesh before entering the Bay of Bengal. Now, many analysts believe that the river's flow gives China an advantage over India. Now, there's a reason why they believe that. First, they believe that since the river originates in China, Beijing can use its network of dams to manipulate the river's flow and shape how much water flows into India. This is important since millions in India's northeast depend upon the Brahmaputra and its water for drinking, irrigation, fishing, and a number of other activities. Analysts, for example, point to what happened with the Mekong River in Southeast Asia in 2019. Southeast Asian nations like Vietnam and Thailand absolutely depend on the water from the Mekong, which originates in China. However, in 2019 and 2020, China restricted the supply of water to these countries from the Mekong, using its high-powered dams. Earlier in 2019, China released a great deal of water from its dams to generate a record amount of hydroelectricity. And then later in 2019 and 2020, when rainwater replenished its dams, China decided to restrict the flow of water from the Mekong to Southeast Asian countries. The consequences were terrible for a number of these nations, which needed the Mekong's water. Thailand was forced to mobilize its military to respond to a drought emergency, Cambodia saw its fishing industry gutted, and parts of Vietnam lost access to fresh water. Now, China was slammed internationally for its handling of this crisis. But as experts pointed out, China sees water as a national resource and not something that has to be shared with other countries. And experts believe that that has implications for India as well. They fear that China's development of new dams, like the one on the Great Bend that we just talked about, could allow China to weaponize water against India. And this is not just a theoretical concern. For example, let's take the 2017 Doklam incident. Remember that then India sent in its troops to block Chinese infrastructure development on a disputed tri-junction between India, China, and Bhutan. This led to a border standoff between Indian and Chinese soldiers. In response, China stopped sending India some crucial hydrological data on the flow of the Brahmaputra river. That is information that India uses to monitor flooding and prevent natural disasters. This was a crucial indication of how China could use water against India in the event of a geopolitical crisis. Now, this new $137 billion dam on the Brahmaputra could create serious water security problems for India.
India and Bangladesh and Bhutan, all of the Himalayas will be scorched for water in the lean season, because to operate a hydroelectric dam of such a magnitude, a lot of headwater is required. And to maintain their head behind the dam, to such a big kind of a hydroelectric output project, it will be catastrophic for the entire Himalayas.
Some experts also say that there is a realistic concern that China could actually physically restrict the flow of water into India. Can China use its hydroelectric dams, including the one that is just being, which it has just announced that it will build? Can it use its dams to restrict the flow of water to the Brahmaputra?
It definitely can, because it is not bound by any international treaty obligations. It is also has a very bad track record of maintaining international treaty obligations. Even if it has signed it, it has definitely not signed the UN Water Process Convention, so it is not bound by anything like that.
Besides willful obstruction, Chinese dam building on the Brahmaputra could also have major environmental consequences. For example, this latest dam building effort could trigger earthquakes in a sensitive seismic zone that could seriously impact water flows to India. All this means that the possibility of tensions over water and perhaps even conflict cannot be dismissed. This problem becomes even more important when you consider the impact of climate change. India and China are facing serious shortages of water, which makes competition over this vital resource so much more important. For some time now, the fear in India has been that China could use the waters of the Brahmaputra and divert them to supply water-starved regions of the country. But right now, the consensus view seems to be that this diversion of water will not be possible, because the sheer scale of resources and engineering required to do this would make it financially and technically extremely difficult. Now, to be clear, there are a lot of experts who argue that India and China will not really fight over water. Many argue that Chinese dams are merely run-of-the-river projects, which basically means that they have limited ability to store water, and therefore these dams cannot be used to coerce India. This is also, by the way, the official explanation the Chinese government gives, and one that the Indian government has accepted from time to time. These experts also say that most of the water that India gets from the Brahmaputra derives from rainfall that happens once the river has actually entered into India. So China has little ability to restrict this flow. But others have a slightly different view. They argue that even run-of-the-river dams can store large amounts of water, and despite the fact that India gets most of the Brahmaputra water from monsoon rains, Chinese dam building activities could still wreck the entire river ecosystem. So the big question is, how exactly has India been responding to all of this? Now, over the last 15 years, we have seen a lot of statements from India, since China has been building these hydroelectric dams for some time now. These statements consistently call on China to respect India's interests and to provide more transparency about its hydroelectric projects. Despite this, India and China have been unable to seal a transboundary water agreement on the Brahmaputra. Some Indian officials have periodically suggested building up dams in Arunachal Pradesh as a counter to what China is doing. And China has opposed this because it fears that Indian dams will become a way for New Delhi to assert its territorial control over Arunachal Pradesh. Remember that this is territory that China claims as South Tibet. But while building dams may help India assert territorial control, it doesn't change the fundamental problems raised by China's new dams. Also, using military force doesn't seem like something that India wants to do right now with China. That leaves one viable option: organizing a coalition of countries in the region that works together to address this problem. That would be a big improvement over the current approach, where countries see water and rivers as resources to be fought over by individual countries. Dr. Mirza Zulfikar Rahman of the Institute of Chinese Studies argues that this is exactly the change that India and the rest of the region need.
In classical terms, India cannot do anything in order to prevent China except for using its diplomatic good offices to actually negotiate a deal that actually leads to a co-managing of the river basin. Because at the end of the day, nation states such as China and India have to stop thinking that they could actually control rivers within the nation state boundaries. You know, a river basin is a transboundary river basin, and everyone has a equal right to it. The way forward is to actually show ripening leadership for regional rivers in South Asia and Southeast Asia, and be able to demonstrate that with some diplomatic good offices, we could actually create an international consensus that big dams are a thing of the past, and we actually cannot go for a clean development kind of a pathway through these kind of big dams.
In sum, the development of China's massive and highly expensive new dam could be a major step in the wrong direction. It could damage the fragile ecology of the Himalayas, harm India's water security, and raise tensions in an already sensitive part of the world. It raises the possibility of Asia seeing water wars that we all desperately need to avoid. A different approach is needed, one that India needs to help lead. The task will be tough, but it's exactly the kind of challenge a rising great power like India has to take on. Thank you for watching Threadbare with me, Shashank Matu. You can catch Threadbare next week only on India Today Global.